Some time ago, a woman came to see me. She told me she had stayed silent in her marriage for 22 years. Not because she was afraid of her husband, not because she lacked opinions, but because she believed quietness made her godly. She was known as kind, gentle, easy to live with, but in her own words she felt invisible at her own kitchen table. She said, "Margaret, I don't even know what I think anymore. I only know how to agree." No one had asked her to disappear. Yet somehow over time she did. And what troubled her most was this. She had been praying for peace all those years. Without realizing she had confused peace with silence. She was naturally warm, the kind of woman who laughed easily and filled a room without trying. In her younger years she had opinions, preferences, energy. But somewhere between raising children, supporting her husband's career, and trying to be a good Christian wife, her voice became softer. First it felt like wisdom. She told herself that not reacting was strength, that letting things go was maturity, that yielding was holiness. Her husband wasn't cruel. He wasn't controlling. He simply got used to deciding where they lived, how they spent money, what church they attended, even what problems were worth discussing. And she adapted. She became agreeable, efficient, undemanding. When she felt hurt, she prayed instead of speaking. When she disagreed, she smiled instead of clarifying. When she felt overlooked, she told herself she was being refined. Over time, something subtle began to happen. She no longer knew the difference between patience and avoidance. Her children described her as sweet. Her friends called her low maintenance. But in private moments, she felt a quiet resentment she didn't recognize as her own. Not loud anger, just a dull heaviness. She wasn't oppressed. She was absent. And as I listened to her that afternoon, one question gently formed in my heart. When did silence become her identity? We didn't arrive at clarity quickly. For several sessions she simply described situations. Small ones. A dinner where she agreed to something she didn't want. A weekend plan she adjusted without being asked. A conversation she rehearsed in her head, but never spoke aloud. There was no explosion, just repetition. One afternoon, after she finished describing yet another moment she had let go, she grew quiet. Not defensive, just thoughtful. I remember closing my notebook and asking gently, "What would have happened if you had said what you actually felt?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands and said, almost surprised by her own words, "I don't think I know how anymore." That was the first honest sentence she had spoken about herself. Not about her husband, not about her marriage, about herself. A week later, as we sat together again, I had my Bible open beside me. Not as a tool, just as part of my rhythm. I had been reading from Ezekiel earlier that morning, and during a quiet pause I found myself recalling a single verse. "I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and you will know that I the Lord have spoken." I didn't preach it. I simply said, sometimes we confuse being quiet with being alive in the spirit. She didn't react outwardly, but something settled in the room. To live. Not just to function. Not just to accommodate. To live. And slowly, very slowly, she began to see it. She had confused peace with avoidance. She had confused humility with invisibility. She had confused kindness with fear of disapproval. No one had demanded her silence, but she had offered it. And that realization did not crush her, clarified her. For the first time she understood. The Spirit of God was not asking her to disappear. He was inviting her to live. The realization did not come with tears. Came with discomfort. Not the kind that shames you, the kind that steadies you. One afternoon, she was describing a recent disagreement about finances. It wasn't dramatic. Just a decision her husband made without asking her. She had smiled, nodded, said, "That's fine." But it wasn't fine. As she spoke, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me almost curiously. "I do this," she said. "I make it easy for him to overlook me." There was no accusation in her voice, just recognition. We sat with that for a moment. No one had instructed her to stay quiet. No one had threatened her. Over the years she had simply decided again and again that harmony mattered more than honesty. Felt safer. If she didn't object, there would be no tension. If there was no tension, there would be no distance. If there was no distance, everything must be fine. Except it wasn't. Avoiding conflict had slowly created another kind of distance, the kind that forms inside a person. She had mistaken accommodation for love. She had mistaken silence for maturity. And somewhere along the way, she had begun to believe that her desires were spiritually suspicious. I remember telling her gently, "There is a difference between keeping peace and disappearing." She didn't flinch. She nodded, because deep down she already knew. Taking responsibility did not mean condemning herself. It meant acknowledging that each small silence had been a choice. Understandable, human, but still a choice. And that realization did not weaken her. It returned something to her. The understanding that if she had chosen silence, she could also choose something else. The change did not happen all at once. There was no dramatic conversation at the kitchen table. No speech she had been rehearsing for years. In fact, the moment itself was almost unremarkable. A few weeks later, her husband mentioned making plans for a family gathering. He had already decided the date. Normally, she would have adjusted immediately. This time she paused. Not defiantly, not emotionally, just long enough to check herself. And then she said calmly, "That date doesn't work well for me. I was hoping we could look at another option." No apology attached. No nervous laughter. No softening phrase to make it easier to dismiss. Just clarity. She told me later that her heart was pounding when she said it. Not because she expected anger, but because she wasn't used to hearing her own unedited voice. Her husband looked surprised. Then he asked, "Oh, what were you thinking instead?" That was all. No explosion. No rejection. Just a conversation that had always been available, but rarely entered. She didn't win an argument that day. She didn't reclaim decades in a single moment. But she did something far more important. She remained present. She did not rush to smooth the air. She did not retract her sentence. She allowed her perspective to exist in the room. And when she told me this story, there was no pride in her tone. Only steadiness. For the first time in many years she felt aligned. Not louder. Not dominant. Simply alive. Sometimes the spirit does not begin with transformation that others applaud. Sometimes he begins with one honest sentence, spoken without apology. I have thought about her often since then. Not because her marriage changed overnight, but because she did. She did not become louder. She did not become confrontational. She simply stopped abandoning herself in the name of peace. There is a quiet strength in that. A strength that does not announce itself. It settles. It breathes. When I return to that passage in Ezekiel, "I will put my spirit in you and you will live," I no longer hear it as revival in the dramatic sense. Sometimes living begins much smaller. It begins when a woman allows her voice to exist without apology. It begins when peace is no longer purchased with disappearance. Perhaps the spirit is not asking you to endure more, but to breathe again. And perhaps breathing for you begins with one honest sentence. Spoken gently, but spoken.